I arrived at the restaurant at 6:40 p.m., 20 minutes early, just like I always did for special occasions. The hostess smiled when I mentioned our anniversary and led me to the booth in the corner, the one we'd sat in 15 years ago on our first date. I wore the burgundy dress he'd once called his favorite, paired with the small gold necklace he'd given me on our third year together. Everything about me tonight was a memory he'd once claimed to love. I ordered his favorite beer, set it across from me, and told myself he'd be here soon. Before I continue narrating the story of Elena Reynolds, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. By 7 o'clock, the dinner rush was in full swing, and the restaurant buzzed with laughter and clinking plates. I checked my phone for the first time. No messages, no missed calls, just an empty screen staring back like a dare. The imported beer sat untouched, beads of condensation forming around the bottle's neck like it too was waiting. Nancy, our server from the past, recognized me immediately and clapped her hands when she heard it was our anniversary. "You always looked so in love," she said, offering me breadsticks like a peace offering I hadn't asked for. At 7:15, I made my first call, keeping my voice bright and casual in case anyone was listening. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which wasn't unusual. He often silenced his phone during dinner meetings. Still, a familiar heaviness settled in my chest, like the first crack in a glass you know will shatter eventually. The booth behind me hosted a young couple sharing a milkshake, giggling like they'd never been disappointed before. I looked at them and wondered if I'd ever been that naive, or just willing to pretend longer than most. At 7:30, my stomach began to ache, not from hunger, but from a growing awareness. This wasn't new, this pattern of being left alone to explain, to defend, to smile through red-flagged evenings. I checked his location once, saw he was unavailable, and decided not to look again. My phone buzzed. A text from his friend's wife, Jennifer. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." No context, no explanation. Just a weight dropped on my chest without warning or permission. Nancy approached, offering more breadsticks and a gentle, concerned smile. "He's probably just caught up in traffic," she said, though we both knew she didn't believe it. I managed a half-hearted laugh and waved her off, pretending to scroll through my phone while watching the clock move toward 8 o'clock. Time became something sticky and oppressive, stretching and bending around my thoughts. I tried to remember the last time he had done something thoughtful without being asked, and came up blank. Instead, I remembered the last time he made a joke at my expense and laughed when I didn't. At 8:15, I texted again, this time simpler. "You okay?" The 3 typing dots appeared and disappeared 3 times before vanishing completely, like he was writing something and then changing his mind over and over. That, more than anything, told me he was fine, just not concerned. The couple behind me was now holding hands across the table, exchanging slow smiles. I wanted to scream at them, to shake them and say, "Don't build a life on someone who makes you wait." At 8:45, I called his office, grasping at the last thread of normalcy. Paul, the night guard, answered with his usual warmth. "Oh, he left hours ago," he said cheerfully. "Something about a bet?" Sounded like he was in a great mood. My hand clenched around the phone before I thanked him and hung up, nausea swelling in my throat like a wave I couldn't hold back. The sports bar across the street flickered with neon wings and beer specials. Jake's truck was parked out front, unmistakable with the dented bumper and faded veteran sticker. Suddenly, everything clicked. The silence, the lack of response, the friend's apology, the cheerful Paul. I wasn't waiting on a man who was busy. I was the punchline to someone's joke, the experiment in loyalty they'd decided to test. I stared at the untouched beer across from me and wondered how long they'd been laughing. At 9 o'clock, Nancy brought more coffee without asking. "You sure you don't want to eat?" she said softly, like she already knew I wouldn't. I shook my head, pushing the cup toward her for a refill I didn't need but accepted anyway. The restaurant had quieted down, and the old man at the counter was openly watching me now. I didn't care. Let him see what humiliation looked like up close. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer once more. "They're coming," it read. "Jake's live streaming." Don't react. Just remember who you are. I stared at the message for a long time, the words rearranging themselves into something steady and anchoring. I looked down at my burgundy dress, adjusted the thin gold chain on my neck, and sat up straighter. If they wanted a performance, they'd get one, but not the one they rehearsed. Not tonight. At 9:14, the door chimed, and the cold air rushed in behind them. I heard his voice before I saw him, loud, triumphant, and unmistakably cruel. 3 hours and 14 minutes. He boomed, grinning as he slid into the booth like this was a game he'd just won. His friends trailed behind him, recording, laughing, counting money. The entire diner froze in collective disbelief. He showed his phone to the elderly couple in the booth next to us, bragging, "Told you she'd wait. Bet she'd stay all night if I made her." The woman gasped audibly, her husband muttering something that sounded like, "Disgraceful." Jake sat beside my husband with his phone still filming, while Mike counted crumpled bills like we were a carnival attraction. "So, babe," my husband said, grinning like a man who'd just hit a jackpot, "what did you want to talk about for our anniversary?" I looked at him and felt nothing but the slow crawl of something breaking loose inside me. Nancy's order pad fell to the floor, the sharp slap of it echoing through the stunned silence. For 3 hours she'd watched me slowly unravel and now stood rooted in place, unsure of what to do. My husband smirked at her, amused by the spectacle he'd created. He had always been the type to confuse power with cruelty, control with love. I looked down at my coffee and then back at him, my voice steady as I said, "Nothing important, just wondering when you became this person." His grin faltered slightly, the first crack in the performance he'd orchestrated with such smug precision. I sipped the coffee Nancy had poured with shaking hands, letting the silence stretch into something uncomfortable. The elderly woman across from us raised her phone discreetly, now recording with the same quiet fury I felt brewing inside me. I looked directly at my husband's phone camera, meeting Jake's lens like it was a challenge. "You wanted a show," I said calmly, "so let's give them something they'll remember." Jake's hand jerked, the phone wobbling slightly, unsure now if this was still his content or something else entirely. Mike froze mid-laugh, money still in his hands like an uncashed threat. Tom, the quietest of the group, looked away, suddenly fixated on the peeling corner of the menu. My husband raised an eyebrow, trying to recover his momentum. "Don't be dramatic," he said, the tone familiar, practiced, dismissive. I reached into my purse and pulled out $40, laying it gently on the table for Nancy. She hadn't moved, still rooted by the coffee station, eyes wide and uncertain. "This is for your kindness," I told her softly, "and for not laughing." I stood slowly, my dress catching slightly on the booth, but I didn't rush. There was no urgency in me anymore, only clarity. My husband's friends looked at each other, an unease passing between them like a slow disease. The cameras were still recording, but this wasn't going how they'd planned. "Where are you going?" he asked, voice rising as if volume could restore his authority. "We're not done talking." I turned to him with the kind of gaze that makes men reevaluate what they think they know. "You were done talking when you made a spreadsheet about me," I said evenly, my voice cutting through the low hum of conversation resuming around us. The table behind us gasped, someone whispering, "What spreadsheet?" And suddenly the air felt thinner. 3 hours and 14 minutes, I repeated, and not one of them spent thinking about how I might feel. I bent slightly, leveling with him so he could see my face fully. "So tell me, what kind of man bets on his wife's patience like it's a joke?" The elderly man in the next booth cleared his throat, muttering under his breath, "Not a man I'd call decent." His wife reached out and patted my arm, her grip surprisingly firm for someone so small. "You don't have to stay," she whispered, the kind of encouragement that tastes like freedom. I smiled at her, a real smile, the first I'd felt in hours. "I know," I said, "and I won't." My husband tried to stand, but Jake grabbed his arm, probably realizing that pushing further might tip this from humiliating to dangerous. "Let it go," Jake murmured, voice low but not low enough. "This is already online. People are going to take sides." My husband glared at him but didn't move, his hand frozen mid-reach like he couldn't decide whether to hold me back or just hold on to his image. I turned my back on them all, the bell above the diner door chiming again as I pushed it open. The night air hit my face like a blessing, cool and clean and unburdened by their noise. I walked to my car not because I needed to flee, but because I needed space to breathe. Inside the diner, I could still see him through the window, face red, mouthing something I couldn't hear. Jake was showing Mike something on his phone, maybe replaying the footage they'd intended to use for laughs. But now I was no longer the subject of their joke. I was the author of its ending. My phone buzzed as I sat behind the wheel, engine off, fingers tight around the steering wheel. Jennifer again. I'm watching the stream. You were brilliant. I didn't feel brilliant, just tired and oddly weightless, like I'd been carrying something invisible for years without realizing how much it cost. A second message followed. They're already scrambling to control the narrative. I stared at the words, letting them settle before replying, "Let them. I've got nothing left to hide." Instead of driving away, I sat with the engine off and the windows cracked, letting the noise of the street fill the silence they'd left in me. I thought of the times he'd made me question myself, the moments he'd smiled while I apologized for not being better. I thought about Sarah, my college roommate, and the dinner I'd left halfway through because of a fake emergency. I thought about the promotion I'd turned down after another one of his talks, and I realized none of it had been isolated, just pieces of a long, slow erasure. Inside the diner, Nancy was now clearing the table, face set like someone trying not to cry. I made a mental note to leave a review, not for the food, but for the kind of quiet courage only people like her can give. The old couple were speaking to each other with hushed intensity, still watching the booth where the men sat awkwardly now. The power had shifted and they knew it, even if they didn't understand how. I was no longer the woman who waited. The car lights in the lot flickered as someone turned over an engine nearby, a sharp reminder that the world kept spinning, even when mine had tilted. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone again, this time scrolling to the photos I never posted. The ones where I looked tired, worn down, made small so he could stand taller. The ones I'd deleted, re-uploaded, refiltered, trying to look grateful instead of gutted. No more of that. I opened my notes app and began to write, not a story, not a blog post, just facts. Dates he'd tested me, times he'd belittled me, receipts of apologies I'd issued like currency. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but writing it felt like reclaiming something that had been taken quietly, piece by piece. I wasn't documenting to punish, I was documenting to remember, to make sure I never waited again. I stayed in that parking lot until the lights inside the diner dimmed and the staff started cleaning. My phone had gone quiet, the frenzy of messages slowing as the internet devoured its newest scandal. I knew I'd wake up tomorrow to texts, missed calls, maybe even flowers. I also knew none of it would change what had happened. Some things break loud, and some things break slowly, over 15 years of silence, until all that's left is the sound of your own voice, finally clear. I didn't go home right away, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to return to the house that had become a shrine to his control. My car idled in a grocery store parking lot 20 minutes from the diner, headlights off, fingers still tight around the steering wheel. I could feel the imprint of the booth seat on the back of my thighs, the residue of 3 hours spent trying not to crumble. My phone sat on the passenger seat like a sleeping animal, silent for the first time in hours. The silence felt like an answer to a question I hadn't realized I was asking. At 11:47 p.m., I walked into a small roadside motel and paid for a room in cash, using the emergency money I kept hidden in the lining of my purse. The man at the front desk didn't ask questions, just handed me the key with a nod that felt strangely respectful. Room 204 was nothing special. Floral bedspread, one lamp, and the faint scent of bleach clinging to the air. I locked the door, leaned against it, and let myself sink to the floor, not from exhaustion but from release. For the first time in years, I was alone without being lonely. I showered in near scalding water, scrubbing off the residue of that diner, of that spreadsheet, of the years I'd spent trying to be small enough for him to love me. As the water ran down my back, I saw myself clearly for the first time, not as his wife, not as someone's disappointment, but as a woman finally learning to see the cracks as light instead of failure. I wrapped myself in the too-stiff motel towel and sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through Jennifer's messages again. She'd sent me 4 new screenshots, text threads between our husbands, casually cruel, full of emojis and inside jokes. One of them read, "3 hours, boys." Bet she's still there with warm coffee and colder dreams. Another message from Jennifer appeared, "Do you want the others?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want them, but because I needed to brace myself. The truth had already bruised me. I wasn't sure how deep the wound would go if I let it all in. But then I thought of how many times I'd made excuses for his behavior, how many times I'd turned betrayal into miscommunication. So I texted back, "Send everything." The files arrived in a flood: screenshots, video clips, transcriptions of messages from over 2 years. They called it the Training Project. A joke, according to them, but each file revealed how real it had been. Points assigned for obedience, penalties for dissent, public compliance tracked like a dog show scorecard. My name was highlighted in yellow. Beneath it, comments in red: responds well to silence, adjusts behavior quickly when isolated. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come, only a strange whimper from my throat that didn't feel like mine. My hands shook as I held the phone, scrolling through messages that read more like lab notes than conversations between husbands. Control comes from patterns. Mike had written, "Make her unsure what's right or wrong, and she'll beg for approval." Jake replied, "Pat on the head still works, they crave it." I opened a new note on my phone and started copying the most damaging screenshots into it. I added a title, "Receipts." I didn't know yet what I'd do with them. Post them online, send them to his boss, bury them in the cloud, but I knew I wouldn't delete them. Evidence was power now. And I was done giving mine away. It was almost 3 a.m. when I finally lay down, phone face down, motel lamp still on. I didn't sleep much, but what little rest I found was different, untethered to anyone else's schedule, not haunted by footsteps in the hallway or a call to bring another drink. I woke up to sunlight sneaking past the heavy curtains, golden and soft like something sacred. My husband still hadn't called, not even a lazy "where are you" or a sarcastic "have fun being dramatic." The silence said more than any message could. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in a coffee shop down the street, dressed in jeans and a gray sweater that didn't itch or squeeze or require approval. I had my laptop open, a burner email account ready, and an encrypted folder labeled "Ball and Chain Files." I didn't send them yet. Not to the HR departments, not to the wives, not to the internet. Instead, I researched lawyers. Not just any lawyer, someone who made her name burning down the lives of men who thought they were untouchable. Her name was Sylvia Martinez, and every article about her used words like ruthless, strategic, and unstoppable. I emailed her office with a subject line that read, "High-profile domestic psychological abuse, ready to file." I attached a redacted copy of the spreadsheet, some screenshots, and a summary of the live stream from the diner. I included a timeline, complete with emotional manipulation patterns, false emergencies, and financial decisions made without my knowledge. Then I hit send, my fingers trembling but my heart beating steady. By noon, Sylvia's assistant had replied, "Ms. Martinez is available at 4 o'clock today. She's already begun reviewing your documents. This case matters." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond to something that sounded so believing. After years of gaslighting and subtle erasure, the idea that someone saw the pattern and took it seriously felt like walking into sunlight after years in the dark. I whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. As I left the coffee shop, a familiar ringtone buzzed from my phone, the one assigned to my husband. I didn't answer. I watched it ring, let it vibrate across the wooden table, then pressed decline without a second thought. 10 seconds later, another call came from a blocked number. Then another. I turned the phone off and walked out onto the street, the October air cool against my skin, not cold, just crisp like clarity. I knew he wasn't worried. He was unraveling. Not because I was gone, but because I wasn't behaving the way he'd trained me to. He'd planned the joke, not the aftermath. At 3:45 p.m., I walked into Sylvia Martinez's law office, every step feeling like a claim to something he'd tried to take. My name, my time, my future. The receptionist offered me water, the good kind in glass bottles, and a quiet room while I waited. The walls were lined with awards, photos of women standing proud in courtrooms, headlines that read like vindication. When Sylvia entered, she didn't shake my hand right away. She looked me in the eye and said, "Let's take him apart carefully." I nodded, letting the words settle like armor on my shoulders. Sylvia Martinez didn't ask me to retell the story from the beginning. She already had a printed stack of documents highlighted in precise neon strokes. She slid them across the table, her nails tapping thoughtfully as I scanned the notes she'd made. Phrases circled in red, timestamps marked, psychological terms annotated in the margins. "We're going to approach this from 3 angles," she said plainly. "Emotional abuse, financial control, and public defamation." She paused, then added, "You gave them the footage by letting them film you. Now we'll use it as evidence of pattern and intent." It was the first time someone had treated my humiliation as valuable instead of pitiful. She asked questions I didn't expect, not about how I felt, but about what I knew. Did he have passwords saved? Did he ever take out credit cards in my name? Was my name on any of his business paperwork, even if he told me it was just for formality? I answered as best as I could, surprised by how much I'd stored away without realizing it was evidence. "Women don't forget the details," she said with a half smile. "It's how we survive." By 5:30, Sylvia had already looped in her financial analyst, a quiet woman named Rachel who wore sharp glasses and a sharper expression. "If he has any assets he didn't disclose, we'll find them," Rachel said, pulling up a spreadsheet of her own. Unlike theirs, hers was clean, factual, devoid of cruelty. "Most men like your husband think they're smart," she added, "but ego makes them sloppy." I left Sylvia's office with a plan, a timeline, and the strange sensation of having allies for the first time in years. On the elevator ride down, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. Same face, same tired eyes, but something else beneath the surface. Not fire exactly, but ember. The kind that doesn't burn out, just waits for the right breath of air. I was that breath now. When I got back to the motel, my phone had 16 missed calls, all from numbers I didn't recognize. One voicemail stood out. His voice, tight and angry. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're embarrassing both of us." I didn't listen to the rest. There was nothing he could say that would outweigh what he'd already done. Let him stew in uncertainty for once. Jennifer texted just after 7 p.m. with a photo of Tom sitting in a dim living room, beer in hand, watching the diner stream play on a loop on a large screen TV. "He keeps saying it wasn't supposed to go viral," she wrote. "His mom saw it," I replied. "Mine did too." We exchanged no more words that night, but we didn't need to. At 10 p.m., I finally drove home, not because I missed it, but because there were things I needed to collect before I left for good. The porch light was still on, the one I'd left before heading to the diner, casting a sterile glow on the welcome mat I'd hated since we bought it. His car was gone, probably at Jake's, or parked a few blocks away in some weak attempt at staging concern. I walked through the front door and was greeted by silence. Not peace, not comfort, just an absence where something hateful used to breathe. I didn't pack much, only what I needed. My documents, my clothes, a box of old journals he'd once called useless clutter. I grabbed my mother's ring from the back of the drawer, the one he said looked cheap. I took our wedding photo off the wall and turned it to face the wall, not from spite, but because I refused to let it look at me while I walked out. I left him a note beside his coffee mug. 3 hours and 14 minutes. You won't get a second round. The hotel Sylvia arranged was across town, long-term, safe, under my maiden name. The man at the desk handed me the key without looking too long at my face, and I appreciated that. Room 615 smelled faintly of cedar and new beginnings. I unpacked, hung the burgundy dress in the closet, and placed the journals on the nightstand like they belonged there. I fell asleep with the window cracked and the blinds half open, welcoming the light in for once. The next morning, I met Rachel again at a quiet cafe near downtown where she pulled out a folder labeled Davidson Financial. "He's got crypto," she said without preamble, "and not just a little. Hidden wallet linked to an email address he created 6 months ago. We traced it through a burner laptop registered to your shared IP." I blinked, not surprised, but exhausted by how predictable he'd become. Rachel continued, flipping the folder toward me so I could see the paper trail. "He's got a slush fund titled Freedom Plan, and he's been funneling small amounts from your joint account into it for over a year. Each transaction had a date and amount, always less than $1,000, never at the same time each week. Spread out to avoid detection," Rachel explained. But not clever enough to avoid me. She handed me a list of his hidden assets, including a shell company under his cousin's name, with me listed as a silent partner. "This is illegal," I whispered, eyes scanning the document. "And now it's evidence," Rachel said. "He used your credit for the company registration. That's both fraud and forgery if you never gave consent." I texted Jennifer immediately, sending her a screenshot of the Freedom Plan spreadsheet. "Check for anything like this," I wrote. She replied with a single word, "Holy." 5 minutes later, she sent back her own version, with Tom's name replaced, but the structure identical. These men hadn't just shared jokes, they'd shared blueprints. Rachel and I discussed next steps, and she promised to bring in legal consultants to prepare for asset seizure if needed. "He's going to panic once he realizes we found the money," she said. "And panic makes people reckless. That's when they expose themselves." I nodded slowly, realizing how much damage a fragile ego could cause when threatened. As I walked back to my car, the city felt different. Less like something to escape, and more like something I might claim. The air was brisk and honest, the kind that doesn't pretend to be gentle, but tells the truth about what's coming. I slid behind the wheel, checked my phone, and saw a single text from him. "We need to talk." I didn't reply. Talking was for people who'd earned the right to be heard. The next morning, I sat at a long wooden table in Sylvia's private conference room while her legal team laid out folders like battle maps. Each section was labeled emotional abuse, financial fraud, digital evidence, public defamation. Rachel joined us via video call, confirming that additional assets were being tracked, investments made in my name without consent, loan applications bearing forged signatures. One document showed he'd used my social security number to secure a loan for a vacation rental property Jake now listed on Airbnb. "This isn't just a divorce case," Sylvia said, leaning forward. "It's federal. We decided not to notify him yet, not until the subpoenas were drafted and the financial holds were secured. Let him keep thinking you're licking your wounds," she said. "He'll underestimate you longer that way." I asked about the other wives, about Jennifer and Sandra, and what legal options they had. "If we move together," Sylvia explained, "we have more leverage. His friends are exposed now too, and group cases make better headlines." I reached out to Jennifer that evening, meeting her in a small cafe that didn't play music and smelled like chamomile and purpose. She arrived looking tired but electric, like someone who'd been living in survival mode too long but now had direction. "He's trying to get ahead of it," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Posted on Facebook that he's being emotionally abused by a vindictive ex-wife." I raised an eyebrow, but she shook her head and smiled thinly. "Don't worry." Nancy from the diner already commented. Sandra joined us minutes later, hair pulled back, face flushed from walking. She dropped her bag on the floor and pulled out a manila envelope. "I've been keeping records since the divorce," she said. I thought no one would believe me, so I held on to everything. Text threads, bank statements, even old voicemails. She passed the folder to me, and I felt the weight of her story before I even opened it. We were all collectors of proof, building a museum of betrayal we never wanted to curate. By the time we left the cafe, we'd agreed to share everything with Sylvia's team. 3 women with 3 sets of receipts. It felt like drawing swords in a war we hadn't started but now had the audacity to finish. As we stepped out into the cold evening air, Jennifer looked at me and said, "He's going to say we're hysterical." I shrugged, pulling my coat tighter, then let him choke on our clarity. The following day, Sylvia scheduled a joint strategy meeting with the 4 of us. Me, Jennifer, Sandra, and Maria, who had flown in from out of state after her daughter found the group chat saved in an old laptop. Maria was soft-spoken, but carried a presence that demanded respect. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted Jake's control over their finances, his calculated withholding of affection, the way he'd trained her to apologize for things she hadn't done. "I thought I was alone," she whispered, "but now I'm furious. We decided to synchronize our filings, 4 cases, same day, same hour. They built this together," Sylvia said, motioning toward the growing wall of evidence behind her. "So we'll take it apart the same way." I asked if we could leak anything ahead of time. "Not yet," she replied, "but soon. And when we do, we won't need to scream. The receipts will do the talking." That night, I returned to my hotel room to find a handwritten letter slipped under the door. The handwriting was unmistakable. His, sharp and controlled. The same style he'd used on our anniversary cards. I opened it cautiously, already bracing myself. Inside were 4 sentences. "You're being dramatic. You're overreacting. We had a system that worked. Come home." I folded the letter once, then again, and dropped it in the trash without reading it a second time. The next morning brought something unexpected. An email from Morrison Industries, the company he'd been trying to get into for over a year. I stared at the subject line, "Interview Feedback Request." For a moment I thought it had been misdirected, but when I opened it, the message was addressed to me. Cynthia Morrison had BCC'd me on an internal company thread discussing his behavior during the interview process, the spreadsheet footage, and the public backlash. I called Sylvia immediately, forwarding the email. She confirmed Cynthia was part of her network. "This is good," she said. "It proves professional consequences." That spreadsheet went beyond personal abuse. It crossed into workplace ethics and corporate liability. A second email followed. Cynthia's official rejection. "We're no longer considering Mr. Davidson for any role at Morrison Industries. His leadership philosophy does not align with our values." I printed the rejection and added it to my growing folder. Every page felt like a step closer to a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. Not the performer, not the peacekeeper, but the woman who remembered her own voice. Jennifer texted late that night with a screenshot from Tom's Facebook. He'd posted a black and white photo of himself with a caption about overcoming betrayal and finding strength in solitude. The comments were a mix of pity and confusion until someone linked the diner footage in reply. "Is this you?" one person asked. "Because if so, you're not the victim here." The post disappeared within minutes. Rachel called the next day with another update. "The crypto wallet was tied to an IP used at your home address," she said. "We've got jurisdiction. He can't claim ignorance, especially since we found notes about it in his email drafts." She sent me a screenshot. Subject line, "Freedom Fund. Final update." The body was short. "Once she breaks, we'll cash out." I forwarded the message to Jennifer, who responded almost immediately. How many of us were they planning to break? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew the truth was deeper than cruelty. It was strategy. It was sport. It was a system. That night, I drove by our house one last time. The porch light was still on, just as I'd left it, but everything else felt different, like it no longer belonged to me, like it had never really been mine at all. I didn't park in the driveway, just sat across the street with the engine running and the headlights off, watching the windows glow like nothing had changed. From the outside, it still looked like our house. Trimmed hedges, the wreath his mother gave us still hanging on the door, porch light faithfully on. But I knew better now. It was a stage set for a lie, a shrine to control disguised as comfort. I didn't miss the house. I missed the woman I thought I was when we bought it. That illusion had cracked clean down the center the moment he bragged about my loyalty to strangers holding a camera. A motion in the window drew my attention. He was pacing, phone to his ear, brows furrowed like a man under siege. His silhouette was sharp against the warm light, familiar in its restlessness, but stripped of power now that I'd stepped out of frame. I wondered if he was calling Tom or Mike, maybe trying to regroup now that their system was collapsing. Every story has a tipping point, and this was his, pacing inside a house filled with silence and evidence. I almost pitied him, but the feeling passed quickly. The next morning, I walked into Sylvia's office with a purpose I hadn't felt since college, when ambition hadn't yet been whittled down by compromise. She greeted me with a folder already prepared, labeled Davidson Public Strategy. Inside were talking points, press contacts, and outlines for a joint statement from the wives. "They're going to go public before we do," she said, "but we'll control the narrative." I nodded, feeling the ground steady beneath me. Rachel joined us moments later with fresh intel. Jake's ex-wife had connected the dots on another property purchased using their daughter's social security number. "They're reckless now," she said, sliding photos across the table. "Scrambling, making mistakes, covering tracks that were never hidden well to begin with." Jennifer arrived next, hair in a tight ponytail, coffee in hand, eyes sharp with clarity. "Tom tried to reset our shared cloud account," she said. "Didn't realize I'd already mirrored it. We spent the afternoon mapping timelines, cross-referencing messages and financial transfers, tracking how 4 men turned their marriages into a spreadsheet competition. Each discovery built a story more horrifying than the last. Bets made on obedience, logs of performance declines, coded language like retraining phase and non-compliance episodes. I found my name next to a column labeled Predictability Factor High. Tom had once written, "Once you know her cycle, you can control her mood." My stomach churned as the words hit like gravel against glass. Sylvia tapped the table for silence. "We've got enough," she said. "We're filing next week. Divorce, financial fraud, and a coordinated civil suit for emotional abuse and public defamation." I exhaled slowly, the weight of years shifting in real time. "We'll go quiet until then," she added. "Let them talk themselves into deeper holes." That evening, back in my hotel room, I received a voicemail from his mother. Her voice was brittle but composed, as if trying to perform grace through gritted teeth. "I don't agree with everything he's done," she said, "but airing it publicly isn't the answer. This will ruin him." I deleted the message without saving it. She hadn't spoken up when he was recording me like a sideshow attraction. She didn't get to call for silence now. I sat on the bed and stared at the papers Rachel had printed. Property deeds, email headers, group chat messages. The evidence of their downfall printed in black and white. But it wasn't the destruction I cared about anymore. It was what came after. What kind of woman rises after being trained to kneel? I drafted a letter to myself, future me, the one who would no longer flinch at the sound of a raised voice or apologize for taking up space. I wrote about the way Nancy's hand had shaken when she poured that last cup of coffee. I wrote about the woman at the next booth who recorded without fear. I wrote about Jennifer's quiet fury and Maria's trembling voice turned steel. And I ended with 5 words: "Don't wait. Don't go back." 2 days later, a journalist contacted Sylvia requesting comment on the diner video, which had now surpassed 200,000 views. "We can't confirm or deny identities at this time," Sylvia replied, but privately told us, "It's starting." The hashtags had begun trending. Hashtag 3 hours and 14 minutes. Hashtag ball and chain gang. Hashtag wife metrics. Women from across the country began sharing their own stories in the comments. Spreadsheets, emotional withholding, calculated silence, and affection offered like rewards. What began as a joke had become a mirror for thousands. At our next strategy meeting, Maria brought her daughter, now 17, quiet but fierce. She'd started a private forum for girls with mothers like us, women trained to doubt themselves and taught to shrink. "They want to learn from us," she said, sliding her laptop forward. "They don't want to become us." I watched the screen populate with names and posts, each one like a thread weaving a larger tapestry of awakening. The night before filing day, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, wrapped in a blanket, the city lights flickering like nervous stars. I thought of our wedding day, how he'd cried during his vows and called me his safe place. I remembered how I used to repeat those words in my head when his silence lasted days. Funny how even kindness, when weaponized, becomes a cage. At dawn, I dressed in navy slacks, a cream blouse, and flats that didn't pinch my feet. No performance, no costume, just comfort and control. I arrived at Sylvia's office before anyone else, waiting at the table with coffee I brewed myself. Jennifer arrived next, then Sandra and Maria, each woman dressed not for battle, but for sovereignty. At 9:02 a.m. we filed the paperwork. By noon it was trending worldwide. We didn't hold a press conference or stage a dramatic reveal. We didn't have to. The filings spoke for themselves, and so did the women sharing their own versions online, each one validating the others. Cynthia Morrison posted a public statement supporting the initiative, calling for stricter corporate ethics and condemning personal abuse disguised as professional leadership. A dozen CEOs shared her post within the first hour, and one by one, companies began reviewing internal complaints with new urgency. The fire had caught, and no one wanted to be seen shielding the kind of men who made spreadsheets about obedience. He texted me 3 times that afternoon, each message more frantic than the last. First, "What are you doing?" Then, "You're making a mistake." And finally, "Please, we can fix this." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned off my notifications and watched the view count on the diner footage climb past 500,000. Tom tried to do damage control with a live video, blaming, quote, "cancel culture" and private jokes taken out of context. He looked into the camera like a man still convinced he could win the room back with charm. But someone in the comments posted a screenshot of his group chat entry labeled, "Jennifer requires frequent correction." It spiraled from there, with women posting their own versions of correction. And by the end of the hour, the only thing trending higher than his apology was #CorrectThis. Sandra texted a single word, boom. Mike was fired by the end of the week after his company's HR department received copies of the spreadsheet and group messages. His profile disappeared from the company website, and his LinkedIn quietly changed to "Seeking New Opportunities." Jennifer sent me screenshots of a now-deleted Reddit thread where Mike had tried to defend himself anonymously, only to be recognized by phrasing he'd reused from the chat logs. Jake went silent altogether, his accounts wiped, his phone disconnected, his name now a cautionary tale in support groups. They weren't leaders anymore, just data points in a study of collapse. My husband lasted the longest, clinging to plausible deniability, insisting that everything had been exaggerated. He posted a photo of himself at the courthouse filing a motion to contest the divorce, captioned, "Fighting for what matters." But the comments weren't what he expected. Dozens of women shared the diner video underneath, each with captions like, "You trained her to leave," and "What matters is respect." He deleted the post within the hour. Meanwhile, Sylvia's office was flooded with inquiries, women asking for consultations, lawyers offering to volunteer time, media outlets requesting interviews. We agreed to do one piece, together, as a collective. A long-form article with names, details, screenshots, and outcomes. "Let's not make this a story about broken marriages," Maria said in the meeting. "Let's make it about women who figured out they weren't broken." The journalist, Vanessa, arrived at Cynthia's office with 2 assistants and a small mountain of notebooks. She didn't ask questions like, "Why did you stay?" or "Did you ever love them?" Instead, she asked about timelines, behaviors, the psychology of silence, and the architecture of emotional warfare. She interviewed us individually, then brought us together to trace how the men's strategies overlapped. "It's like they were sharing a manual," she said, "but you wrote your own ending." The article published on a Sunday morning with the headline, "The Ball and Chain Gang: How 4 Women Took Down a System of Silent Abuse." It was shared 700,000 times in 3 days. The diner video was embedded, now edited into a short film with commentary from psychologists and advocates. Support groups popped up across the country, online forums, local meetups, safe planning resources for women unsure where to start. A foundation was launched in our names, funded in part by Cynthia's company and in part by anonymous donors. That week, I moved into a new apartment across town, small, sunlit, and entirely mine. I painted the walls a soft sage green and unpacked slowly, choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. The wedding photo didn't make it. Neither did the anniversary wine glasses or the knife set he'd insisted on picking himself. But my mother's ring sat in a dish by the sink, and my journals lined a shelf where I could see them every morning. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a message from a woman in Ohio. Her husband had started calling her forgetful and emotional, slowly taking control of their bank accounts and passwords. She'd seen the article and realized the pattern matched hers. "I thought I was being paranoid," she wrote, "but now I know it has a name, and I'm not alone." I replied with Sylvia's contact and ended with, "You're not paranoid, you're perceptive." Jennifer started her own consulting firm for women leaving high-control marriages. Sandra partnered with a cybersecurity expert to help women secure their digital lives before leaving. Maria's daughter published a piece in a teen magazine about what it means to grow up watching your mother reclaim her voice. We spoke on panels, gave lectures, and co-wrote guides for therapists and advocates. We didn't just leave the system. We dismantled it, brick by toxic brick. My husband texted me once more, weeks later, after most of the dust had settled. "I miss you." That's all it said. I didn't respond, but I didn't block him either. I wanted him to see that silence could be a boundary too, not just a punishment. Cynthia called one morning with news. "Harvard wants to use your story as a case study in their MBA ethics program." I almost laughed. The same man who once told me business schools were a waste of time for women would now be a warning label on a syllabus. I said yes, not out of spite, but because education leads to prevention. On the one-year anniversary of the diner incident, Nancy mailed me something unexpected. A framed photo, black and white, taken by the diner's security camera the moment I stood from the booth. I was holding my purse, standing tall, expression unreadable but undeniably done. The caption she'd included on a note read, 3 hours and 14 minutes, no more. I hung it in my office. The Harvard case study launched during the spring semester under the title Waited, Watched, Walked, a case in power, abuse, and corporate responsibility. Cynthia and I were invited to speak on a guest panel alongside professors from law, psychology, and business ethics. I sat in front of 200 students, many of them young men in crisp shirts and ambition-shaped spines, and told them how a spreadsheet meant to dehumanize became the foundation of a movement. "If you manage people like pets," I said, "don't be surprised when they bite back." The room was quiet in that deliberate way that follows realization. One student, a woman in the front row, asked how I stayed so calm in the diner that night. I told her the truth. I wasn't calm. I was finished. There's a difference between silence out of fear and silence forged from resolve. The former trembles, the latter burns. I didn't raise my voice because I wanted every man at that table to hear how unshaken I'd become. After the panel, a male student approached me in the hallway, his expression one of conflicted respect. "My girlfriend made me read the article," he said, rubbing the back of his neck like he was still figuring out if he was on the right side. "I thought it was exaggerated until I saw how much of it sounded like stuff I've said." I didn't let him off the hook with reassurance. "Then stop saying it," I replied, and walked away. Back home, Jennifer's consulting firm had expanded to 2 new cities, both funded by women who'd left controlling relationships and wanted to help others. Sandra's cybersecurity initiative had been featured on a morning show, teaching women how to secure their digital lives during separation planning. Maria's daughter, now a college freshman, began filming a documentary titled "The System Was Built for Them," interviewing not only us, but social workers, teachers, and divorce attorneys. Our stories had become blueprints for others, but we knew we weren't the first. Just the first to do it this loudly. At Morrison Industries, I was promoted to Director of Organizational Health, tasked with ensuring no woman within the company ever experienced what I had. We built policies around psychological safety, whistleblower protections, and behavioral accountability in management roles. One executive resisted, saying our new policies were too reactive. I printed the spreadsheet, my spreadsheet, and handed it to him without speaking. He never brought it up again. On the anniversary of the diner, I returned, not to remember the pain, but to mark how far I'd come. Nancy greeted me at the door like I was an old friend, and she led me straight to the same booth. I didn't cry, didn't flinch. I ordered a coffee and watched as another woman sat 2 booths away, fidgeting with her phone, looking at the door too often. When she stood to leave 10 minutes later without anyone arriving, she glanced at me, and I nodded, just once. That weekend, I hosted a dinner for Jennifer, Sandra, and Maria in my new apartment. It wasn't fancy: roasted vegetables, pasta, and the kind of wine we used to only buy for anniversaries we hoped would matter. We sat on the floor, laughing about the awkward post-divorce dates, the DMs from self-proclaimed nice guys, and the clueless relatives who still didn't get it. At one point, Sandra raised her glass and said, "To the women we used to be, and to the ones who'll never have to become them." After they left, I found myself scrolling through an old folder labeled Us, a collection of photos I'd refused to delete until now. I saw myself in a dozen different poses, smiling next to him, holding his hand, adjusting his tie. But in every photo, I was turned slightly toward him, like he was the sun and I was supposed to orbit. I closed the folder and renamed it Her. That woman deserved to be remembered, not for how she bent, but for how she eventually stood. A month later, the FBI investigation into the Freedom Fund was complete. All 4 men had been charged with various degrees of financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Rachel had testified before a federal grand jury, detailing how they'd used their wives' identities to secure loans and investments. "They planned their freedom by exploiting yours," she told the court. None of the men looked up when she said it. Tom accepted a plea deal and moved back in with his mother, restricted by a court-ordered curfew and mandatory counseling. Mike tried to flee to another state but was arrested at the airport with forged documents. Jake pleaded not guilty but was denied bail after it was revealed he'd tried to bribe a former coworker to destroy evidence. My husband, now officially my ex, hired a defense attorney who quit 2 weeks later after discovering the full scope of the case. His new attorney opened with, "My client was influenced by his peers." During sentencing, the judge read parts of the spreadsheet aloud in the courtroom. "Dinner punctuality, obedience rating, public compliance," he recited, each phrase hanging heavy in the stillness. "This is not the language of marriage. This is the language of ownership." I sat in the front row, hands folded, Jennifer and Maria on either side of me. None of us cried. The final sentence, 4 years in federal prison plus restitution to each of us for emotional damages and fraudulent use of identity. The courtroom emptied slowly, reporters waiting outside, microphones and flashes buzzing like flies. I stepped into the sunlight, blinking, not from brightness, but from the shock of freedom. A different kind of freedom, the kind I didn't have to pay for with silence. Just outside the courthouse, a stranger handed me a note with a single sentence: "You made us brave." That evening, I received a message from Rachel. The foundation we'd discussed, the one meant to fund legal aid for women escaping financial and psychological abuse, had received its first anonymous $1 million donation. She wanted me to name it. I didn't hesitate. The 314 Project. We launched the 314 Project with little fanfare but enormous reach, a quiet ripple that turned into a wave. The goal was simple: fund legal aid, secure safe housing, and educate women about the patterns before they became permanent. Sandra designed the digital security toolkit, Jennifer curated a network of vetted attorneys, and Maria oversaw survivor mentorship programs. I became the face of it, not because I wanted to be, but because too many women needed to see someone who'd walked through the fire and kept walking. We didn't offer rescue, we offered a roadmap. In its first month, the project funded 12 emergency relocations, 17 legal consults, and 4 court wins. The stories that came in weren't carbon copies of ours, but echoes with the same rhythm: minimized voices, delayed dreams, choices made small so someone else could feel large. One woman wrote, "I waited 3 hours for him at our child's school conference. The teacher assumed I was a single mom. That night I realized I was." I added her line to the wall of quotes in my office. a timeline of clarity carved in ink. Cynthia hosted a private roundtable for corporate executives to discuss how patterns of domestic control mirrored toxic workplace hierarchies. "If you think your boardroom is separate from your bedroom," she said, "you're not paying attention." HR directors listen differently now, reviewing complaints through the lens of power abuse, not just policy violations. I shared the metrics they'd used on me: obedience, punctuality, public compliance, and watched a woman from a Fortune 100 company go pale. "We use similar behavioral tags in our talent development framework," she admitted quietly. The impact spread faster than I imagined, not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. Women recognize themselves in the cracks of our story, the pauses, the accommodations, the slow unraveling disguised as love. It wasn't just about abuse. It was about being rewritten one correction at a time. What scared people most wasn't the spreadsheet. It was how easily it could have been theirs. We didn't need to shout anymore. The world had finally learned how to listen. My ex-husband sent one final letter, delivered through his attorney to avoid violating the no-contact clause. It was handwritten on lined yellow paper, his handwriting shaky, not from remorse, but from fear. "You destroyed my life," he wrote. "You cost me everything I worked for." At the bottom, in smaller letters, "Was it worth it?" I folded the letter and placed it in a box labeled "Unsent Apologies," not to forget, but to remember why I would never answer. Jennifer moved into a new home with her daughter and 2 cats, both rescues, with the kind of clingy loyalty only survivors seem to share. Sandra started dating again, carefully, cautiously, and insisted on paying for her own meals on every first date. "It's not about money," she told us. "It's about not owing anyone anything, not even a thank you for showing up." Maria began a podcast with her daughter, interviewing other mother-daughter pairs who had reclaimed generational strength. They called it Breaking the Pattern. I kept the apartment, the one with the sage-green walls and the soft light that spilled through sheer curtains each morning. It never became a fortress. It became a sanctuary. I cooked when I felt like it, read books without hiding the covers, and played music that filled every room with sound. I dated slowly, but I never explained where I'd been or who I used to be. If someone asked why I walked away, I said, because I could. One afternoon, I got an email from a woman who worked at the same diner where it all began. She was 19, in her first semester of college, and part-time waitress to help her mom. "I watched the video again last night," she wrote. "I used to think strength looked like standing up and yelling. But you just stood." She ended with, "I changed my major to psychology. I want to help women see themselves sooner." The message landed differently than all the others. Not heavier, but deeper. It reminded me that what we built wasn't a protest. It was a mirror. We didn't rise from rage. We rose from recognition. Recognition that love without respect is performance. Recognition that obedience is not peace. When the documentary "The System Was Built for Them" premiered, I sat in the front row beside Maria, holding her hand as her daughter took the stage to introduce it. The theater was filled with women and a few men holding tissues, notebooks, each other. The film didn't paint us as victims or saints. It painted us as women who were never broken, just buried. When the lights came back on, no one clapped right away. They were too busy absorbing. The press did what it always does. Headlines about revenge, drama, public downfall. But we never called it revenge. Revenge centers the abuser. What we did was recovery. We pulled back the curtain and dared others to do the same. After the screening, a woman approached me in the lobby. She was older, maybe 60, wearing a wedding ring she kept twisting. "My husband didn't film me," she said. "He didn't need to." I filmed myself, mentally, every time I made excuses for him. I didn't tell her what to do. I just said, "When you're ready, we're here." On the 2-year anniversary of the diner night, Nancy invited me back to unveil something she hadn't told anyone about. The table, our old booth, now had a small brass plaque fixed to its edge. It read, "To those who waited too long. This seat belongs to the moment you decide to walk away." I ran my fingers over the engraving and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, I sat at the booth alone, ordered a coffee, and watched a young couple share pie in the next booth over. They laughed the way people do when they think love is simple and sweet. I didn't envy them. I just hoped they were kind to each other. And if they weren't, I hoped she would know. 3 hours and 14 minutes is more than enough. The next morning, I woke to a quiet apartment, soft light filtering in through the curtains, and the sound of a world that no longer owned me. I brewed coffee in silence, no footsteps demanding attention, no voice asking what I'd done with his keys, his shirt, his plans. I poured it into the mug Cynthia had given me on the day the divorce finalized. White porcelain with black letters. Never wait. It made me smile every time I used it, a small ritual that grounded me in the present. Rituals, I'd learned, were different from routines. One nourishes, the other confines. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Just finished filing IRS fraud reports on all 4 of them. They'll be audited next quarter. I replied with a thumbs up and a quiet laugh, not because it was petty, but because it was deserved. He'd once said I was too emotional to handle finances. Now he couldn't file taxes without triggering a federal review. The irony was clean and sharp. Justice in the language he'd always respected most, numbers and consequences. Later that day, I joined Jennifer at a career panel hosted by a local university, where we spoke about professional resilience and personal clarity. She talked about walking into interviews with a new last name and a louder voice. I spoke about the danger of loyalty without boundaries and how corporations often echo the dynamics of controlling households. A student asked how to recognize red flags early, and I answered with the simplest truth I knew. When you're always adjusting who you are to keep the peace, that's not peace. That's performance. The room went still, the kind of silence that listens. After the panel, we went to dinner with Sandra and Maria, all of us tired but lighter. It was a small Italian restaurant tucked into a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't rush you, where candles flickered in recycled wine bottles. We toasted with water, not wine. None of us needed a buzz to feel brave anymore. "Do you think they talk about us?" Maria asked suddenly, twirling pasta around her fork. Jennifer answered first, her voice dry. "Only when no one else will listen." I got a call later that night from Cynthia, her voice warm with amusement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Your ex's brother just applied for a job at Morrison Industries." I didn't ask what position, didn't care. Cynthia continued. "We denied it, of course, but not before making sure he read our workplace dignity handbook top to bottom." In the weeks that followed, more stories surfaced, women who had been trained, restructured, managed, under the guise of love. Some had stayed for decades. Others had left with only a suitcase and a spine made of willpower. Many used our story as a reference point, not to copy, but to clarify. Not every woman needed a spreadsheet to see herself. Some just needed a sentence, a video, a moment. The 314 Project's inbox overflowed daily with those moments. One day I received a letter through the foundation, handwritten in careful cursive. It was from a woman in her 70s who'd been married 51 years before leaving. "He never hit me," she wrote, "but he made sure I felt small enough that he didn't have to." She ended with, "I waited a lifetime, but thanks to you, my granddaughter won't." We started training modules for high school teachers and counselors, arming them with tools to spot early signs of coercive behavior. Sandra created the Digital Privacy Workshop, which we piloted in 5 schools across the state. Jennifer trained counselors on documenting behavioral shifts in their students, quiet ones who suddenly stopped raising their hands, loud ones who suddenly smiled too much. Maria coordinated parent seminars with therapists and educators. I stood in front of classrooms and told teenage girls they didn't have to earn kindness by shrinking. The second annual 314 conference filled a hotel ballroom with 600 women and allies. The keynote speaker was a woman who'd walked out of a 30-year marriage with nothing but her wedding ring in a shoebox. She held it up during her speech and said, "I kept this to remind myself that love doesn't bind, it frees." The crowd stood as one. We didn't clap because she escaped. We clapped because she arrived. Near the end of the year, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo of a familiar table in a different diner. Same layout, same red vinyl booths, same quiet ache. A woman sat alone, a coffee in front of her, phone face down. On the back, written in blue ink, were 5 words. "I left before he arrived." I placed the photo beside Nancy's plaque, now displayed in our foundation's entrance hall. Visitors always stopped to read it, fingers brushing the metal like it held magic. It didn't. It held memory. Memory of the moment everything changed. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the rooftop of my apartment building, watching fireworks in the distance. Below me, the city pulsed with noise, with people promising change, unaware of how quietly it often begins. I didn't make resolutions anymore. I made choices, daily, deliberate choices to exist fully, to trust slowly, to love conditionally. The woman who waited in the diner didn't vanish. She transformed. As midnight struck, I got a message from the woman in Ohio, the one who waited at her child's conference once. "It's done," she wrote. "House sold. Name changed. Apartment lease signed. I don't even own a coffee mug he touched." I smiled and typed back, "Welcome. You're right on time." Thank you for listening to Elena's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.